Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to discuss the first chapter of Orientalism by Edward Said. The title of this chapter is The Scope of Orientalism. In this chapter, Edward Said has tried to explain how this terminology, how this concept of Orientalism has been developed. He says that he has tried to see and observe all those arguments through which this system of knowledge and system of Orientalism has been developed by the Western scholars in this modern time. Now he says that the Westerners have divided the world into two different spheres. One is ours and the other is theirs. Now the ours is the Western part and theirs is the Eastern part. And he says that they have divided this world in these two spheres on the basis of civilization. The Eastern civilization, the Western civilization. Now he says that it is a very clear indication that there is a huge difference between the Eastern civilization and Western civilization. It is because the way of living is different in both the regions, the way of thinking is different in both the regions, the way of their customs and cultures are very different. That is why they both have differences. But when the Westerners, they came with the idea of colonization and other thinkings, when they came to Eastern part, they saw them with the lens of their own cultures, their own thinking, their own customs. And they found that the Easterners do not follow their rituals, their customs, their way of life. Why? Because Easterners have got different lifestyle. But the Western scholars, the Western thinkers, they did not accept that. They did not accept the indigenous culture and indigenous civilization of the East. So when they went back, they tried to depict, they tried to express they tried to talk about the Eastern part in a very ugly way, in a way that they were called exotic, they were called uncivilized, they were called primitive, they were called backward. So this became the lens for the scholars to come, that they started thinking or they started observing the Eastern with that lens, with that way of thought. So this is how he is trying to develop the argument. He then further says that when this was getting developed, so the Europeans or the Europe became biased and they became selective in their approach, in their defining of the Orients and the Eastern civilization. So in using that, they used different terminologies to describe them. Those terminologies were unknown to the natives, to the Eastern people, and this is how they applied different generalizations, different stereotypes and different ways of thinking of West towards the Eastern. And this is how they started developing this concept of Orientalism and this attributions of others. Like they termed them others. Why? Because they were different. So this is how slowly and gradually they developed this concept. Afterwards, towards the end of this first chapter, Edward Said comes to the main point. He says that the West did all this because they wanted to project themselves as superior. They wanted to make a comparison. They wanted to show the world that they were superior and the others or the uncivilized were uncivilized because they were not following their way of thinking. So this attribution, this stereotyping, this generalization was not something real based or reality based. This was done to show themselves in comparison that they were superior, they were having high thoughts, they were having high knowledge, and this way they just destroyed, they just generalized the whole concept of Orientalism, and this system of knowledge of Orientalism emerged, that the Orients were the others, Orients were the low people, Orients were the uncivilized people, and Orients were the primitive people who did not have a proper way of living, who were not able to govern themselves, who were not able to learn, who were not able to get educated, and who were not able to understand the real meaning of life. So this is what he talks about in the very first chapter of Orientalism, that is the scope of Orientalism. In chapter number 2 of Orientalism, the title of this chapter is Orientalist Structures and Restructures. In this chapter, Edward Said has tried to explain how this Orientalist structures have been formed, how the concept of Orientalism and how the concept of East as other got inculcated into the minds of the Western people. Now he says that the Western people, Western scholars, when they saw this Eastern culture, they went back and they tried to romanticize it. They tried to depict it as a culture that is very much pure, that is very much innocent. So this was taken up by the Western writers, this was taken up by the Western scholars. They presented the literature to the people in which East was shown as a pure civilization, a pure culture, but a pure culture in terms of inferior culture. It was shown that this was East was the region of pure civilization, pure culture, but at the same time this purity was inferiority. This Eastern culture was not up to their mark. It was innocent because it was inferior. And what happened, that the Westerners they took it as their duty to pay a pilgrimage, to visit these Eastern lands and to see how they are innocent and to have a good experience of this Eastern land. So when they would visit it and when they would get back to their own land, they would depict them as inferiors, they would depict them as uncivilized, they would depict them as like people who have nothing of progression, who have nothing of advancement. So this was their first evidence, their first proof that the Easterns were not capable of anything. Then the second proof that why did they govern them, they provided this justification that West was biologically advanced. West was biologically taking advancement in terms of science, in terms of technology, in terms of life as well. So this became the second basis that they needed to educate the East. They needed to govern the East because East was not able to govern themselves. East was not able to rule the Eastern region. So this was presented as another reason that they wanted to govern them, so that they could enlighten them, so that they could civilize them, so that they could educate them, so that they means the West could make the East learn how to live and how to progress in life. And this is discussed towards the end as well, that Edward Said has like explained the works of some of the renowned Orientalists. But the crux of this chapter is again on the same notion that all the depictions, whether it was a pure or innocent depiction, it was inferior depiction, it was biased depiction, the depiction overall is very much prejudiced. The depiction is very much biased depiction because they saw the Orients, they saw the East with their own way of thinking, their own lens. They did not see them who actually the Orients are, who actually the Orients were, and how Orients lived and how Orients had their own distinctive way of life. This was neglected, and whatever they wanted to see in the Orients, they saw it. They went back, they presented and represented it, and they shown it to the people. And in terms, when they paved the minds and paved the way for the thinking of the Western people, what they did, they colonized the Eastern part. They colonized them, they subjugated them, and then they destroyed them, and then they looted the resources from the Eastern region. So this is how this chapter number 2 of Orientalism has been structured by Edward Said. The chapter number 3 of Orientalism is Orientalism Now. In this chapter, Edward Said tries to tell that in the previous centuries, the Western scholars and the Orientalists, they just observed the Orients and then they saw whatever was their lifestyle and they depicted them in their literature. But in the modern centuries, in the 20th century, the Orientalists or the Western, they started to interfere in the lifestyle of the Orients. They started to force them for different happenings, for different activities. It was because they wanted to rule them. So in order to rule them, they wanted to know the basic lifestyle, the basic happenings, the basic day-to-day communications and the basic day-to-day dealings of the Orient people. So they started interfering them, they started working in their politics, they started working in their human nature, and this is how this Orientalism is now changed from the previous centuries. Then he moves towards the next argument that after the World War I, the center of Orientalism moved from Europe to USA. Means America started taking the power, and America started taking the power to interfere in the Arabian region, in the African region, and in the Eastern region, means the Asian region as well. So this is how this Orientalism, with the passage of time, it moved from one part of the continent to the other continent. Then he also says that when World War I and World War II were concluded, so everybody thought that now the colonies are lost, so this Orientalism, this would be destroyed, this concept of Orient and Occident would be no more in the practice, and people would start behaving in a way that they are now equal. But this was just a fantasy. Why? Because as soon as the world wars were done, this prejudice, this bias towards the Orients or the East continued. Still they were seen as inferior people, still they were seen as the people who were uncivilized and who had no activity of life and who had no meaning of life. But one thing changed, that now Europe was behaving more humane, but American continent was behaving more inhumane. And this is how this structure of the whole book of Orientalism has been formed. Though there are many other concepts which we would deal in other short videos, but this was the whole crux of the 3 chapters. There is another concept, that is latent Orientalism and manifest Orientalism. We would be dealing it in the next episode. If there is any question, if there is any dimension, you can kindly relate it into the comment box.